Hi everyone, welcome back again to Smarter Nursing YouTube channel, and today we are going to be considering the menstrual cycle. Firstly, what is the menstrual cycle? The menstrual cycle is a natural process by which the uterus of a woman prepares for a potential pregnancy. So think of the word cycle. It reminds us of something continuous. So that means that this happens continuously to every woman and on an average of 28 days. Firstly, before we dip into the menstrual cycle, I would like us to talk about the ovaries. Now, everything about the menstrual cycle cannot happen without the ovaries being involved. What are the ovaries? The ovaries are part of the uterus. They are the egg producing part of the uterus. Every month, from the on stage of puberty, eggs, also called ovum, are released from the ovary of a female on a monthly basis. Now, let's consider the ovary. It all begins from the primary follicles, and these eggs are usually enclosed in the follicles. And as a matter of fact, it is the follicle that has to mature and rupture to release an egg. So let's go through how that process happens. Firstly, we have the primary follicles, and at the primary follicles, they are still developing, not yet mature. After the stage of the follicles continue to develop, and at that point, it is now called the developing follicle. As we can see here, these were the primary follicles, and now this is the developing follicles. Now, they would continue to go through this process until we get the mature follicle. There are thousands of follicles contained in the ovary of a female, but out of all of them, just one follicle will mature and rupture each month. As we can see, then it becomes the mature follicle at this stage. Right here, it is now mature. The size, we can see the differences in the size. After it matures, it has to rupture because we don't need this follicle at the end of the day outside of the ovaries. This matured follicle is also known as the Graafian follicles. Just like we said, before menstruation or before menarche, the follicles that a female has is known as the primordial follicles. But from the on stage of puberty, a female has a lot of Graafian follicles. Now, this Graafian follicle is what will mature and rupture and release the ovum. Now, from the moment this ovum is released, the cycle is begun because this is ovulation. After it is released, what then happens to the follicle? The follicle becomes a corpus luteum. This corpus luteum, just consider it as the outer covering. Consider an eggshell, and from an eggshell, the yolk is removed. You'd have an outer covering, right? So that's the same way I like to make it make sense in this area. After the stage of the corpus luteum finally becomes the corpus albicans, and at this stage, it degenerates and maybe reabsorbed by the body. Now that we've understood the anatomy of the ovary, I'd like us to look forward to the uterus. So this is the uterus of the female. These ovaries are connected to the uterus by the fallopian tube, also known as the uterine tube. And this is the uterine tube, and these are the ovaries that we talked about here. When this egg is released, it moves into the peritoneal cavity and is finally taken through the fallopian tube, the cilia of the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, into the uterus. If there is a sperm already that has passed through the vagina to the cervix, the fertilization can easily happen at the ampulla of the uterus. So the menstrual cycle is divided into two phases. We have the ovarian phase and the uterine phase, also known as the uterine stage. Now, the ovarian phase, we have the follicular, the ovulation phase, and the luteal phase. Same thing with the uterine phase. We have the menstrual, the proliferative, and the secretory. Now, considering all of these things, I would like you to note before we begin, the follicular phase will overlap with the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase. Ovarian phase begins with the follicular phase. And what happens at this follicular phase? This is simply the phase where the follicles prepares to release the mature egg. Just like we talked about here, these follicles, they first of all develop, and after developing, it is preparing to finally release the egg or the ovum. But this does not just happen. The whole process of the nervous system has, just like we know that the nervous system controls all other systems of the body, that is the same way. Through a negative feedback system, the body recognizes that the reproductive system is low in estrogen and progesterone. But that does not happen that way. Let's look at how that happened through the nervous system. Firstly, the hypothalamus, which is considered the control center, would release a hormone called the gonadotropin releasing hormone. The gonadotropin hormone releasing hormone. Now, when this hormone is released, it would stimulate the anterior pituitary. After stimulating the anterior pituitary, what is it telling the anterior pituitary? It's telling the anterior pituitary that it is time for us to release the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. Now, judging from that stimulation, the anterior pituitary would release the FSH and the LH. When the FSH and the LH is released, the FSH is what helps to stimulate these follicles, just like the name says, follicle stimulating hormone, which is to say that it stimulates these follicles, that it is time for us to release an egg, or saying, let us walk towards releasing the egg. So once these follicles are stimulated, they begin to develop until they get to the mature stage, which is the Graafian follicle, and then it ruptures to release the ovum. The follicle stimulating hormone helps with the release of the estrogen and progesterone. Remember, the cycle is already begun from the follicular stage in the ovarian phase. After estrogen is released, there would be a dip in the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. So it reduces in concentration. Now, because of this, it would continue to remain in that low state. And that's why I wrote here that there would be a dip in FSH and the LH. But it will get to a point that there will be a high peak of estrogen, and at the high peak of estrogen, what then happens? There will be an LH surge. So the luteinizing hormone will be released in plentiful supply. What is the reason for this? Because the luteinizing hormone is what would finally help the rupturing of the Graafian follicle and the release of an egg, which is simply ovulation. And just like I said before, the follicular phase would overlap with the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase. Now let's look at how that happens. When we come to the menstrual phase is simply shedding of the endometrium. After the follicle was released at the follicular phase, estrogen would help to begin the build up of the endometrial layer, particularly the functional layer of the endometrium, in preparation for a pregnancy. But what then happens in the menstrual phase? It means that at this phase, when the ovum was released, there was no sperm in sight. So meaning that there was no fertilization occurring. Now, with the absence of fertilization, there would be decreased levels in estrogen and progesterone. Why would there be decreased level? Because this corpus luteum that was released after the egg was released, the corpus luteum helps in the supply of estrogen and progesterone. But in this case, there is no developing baby. So the corpus luteum would degenerate and become the corpus albicans. And this corpus luteum is what is in charge of producing the estrogen and the progesterone. So because there was no fertilization, there would be a decrease in the level of estrogen and progesterone. Working with a decrease in level of estrogen and progesterone, there would be an endometrial breakdown, because it is the estrogen that helped the endometrium to build up and prepare itself for pregnancy. Now, judging with that, the functional layer of the endometrium would be shed. There will be shed, and that whole process leads to bleeding, which would refer to simply as menstruation. Now, these low levels of estrogen will stimulate the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary that it's time for us to begin another cycle. How does this happen? This is a negative feedback mechanism. And then because no fertilization occurs and there is a dip in estrogen and progesterone, the body is immediately told that, okay, we need to start working to produce more of these. And the only way to produce more of these is by redeveloping follicles. So the body, the hypothalamus will let the anterior pituitary know that it's time to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, just like we can see in the follicular phase, to start back the cycle. And secondly, we are going to look at the proliferative phase. This is the phase where the functional layer of the endometrium rebuilds in preparation of reception. Just like we discussed, when the body is ready to release follicles, at that same time, estrogen helps the uterus to build up. And this build up, just think of the word proliferate, means to multiply, to increase. So this uterus is building itself up, is literally proliferating. So this proliferative process will cause the build up of the endometrium. And that is what happens at the proliferative phase. The functional layer of the endometrium will rebuild in preparation of reception of a fertilized ovum. So at this point in time, the estrogen level is high and the progesterone level is low. Remember that we need the estrogen to build up the endometrium. So the proliferative phase is practically the building up phase. Now we're going to be looking at the ovulation stage in the ovarian phase, and that leads us to the ovulation phase. The ovulation phase is simply when the ovum is released. So what that means is that from the period of time that the ovum is released, we have entered ovulation. Why is ovulation necessary? Because for the reproductive cycle of a female, when we consider fertilization and the birth of a baby, none of these things can happen without the release of an ovum. So the release of an ovum is a very important phase when we come to fertilization. The egg or the ovum that is released only lives for 24 hours. So what that means is that after 24 hours, that egg can no longer be fertilized. If a sperm is present at that stage, what happens is that the sperm would meet up with the ovum, mostly at the ampulla of the fallopian tube, which we'll consider as this area. And when the sperm meets up with the ovum, fertilization can be done. And from fertilization, we can then begin to talk about implantation of this developing embryo at the uterus. So finally, we'll be looking at the luteal phase. The luteal phase works hand in hand with the secretory phase. At the luteal phase, the corpus luteum is formed from follicle cells that remain in the ovary. Remember, after the follicle is mature, it will cause the release of the ovum. After the ovum is released, it will cause the forming of the corpus luteum. Now, this corpus luteum, it is not useless, just like we mentioned before. It helps in the secretion of the progesterone. It also secretes estrogen, but just that it secretes progesterone on higher amounts than estrogen. Now, what would this progesterone do? It just helps with the preparation of implantation and throughout the process of pregnancy. Remember that as this implantation happens, there is a lot of stretching of vessels. The progesterone makes sure that this woman that is pregnant do not have contractions during the period of pregnancy due to the excessive stretching until the period where she is finally ready for conception. Then more estrogen will be released, and this estrogen would help with contraction. And finally, the oxytocin hormone would also help with contraction. But for this stage, the corpus luteum would help to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Now, in a case where fertilization did not occur, corpus luteum would become the corpus albicans. Now, this corpus albicans is a very degenerated state of the corpus luteum. So it will degenerate and finally it's reabsorbed by the body. But in the presence of pregnancy, there is a change. The human chorionic gonadotropin would be released by the developing embryo, and that would help to sustain the life of the corpus luteum so that it can continue to produce progesterone and estrogen until the placenta is fully formed and it will take over the release of progesterone. But at this stage, just consider the luteal phase as when the corpus luteum is what works in the luteal phase. So I kind of think it was named after the corpus luteum, luteal. So when we think of that, we see that at the luteal phase, the corpus luteum is formed from the follicle cells, which is the matured follicle that was ruptured. It is formed. And the estrogen and the progesterone declines, causing anterior pituitary to secrete more FSH and LH. Now, this is what happens when no fertilization occurs. The estrogen rate and the progesterone rate will decline. Why would they decline? Because the corpus luteum will degenerate. And the corpus luteum is in charge of producing the estrogen and progesterone to sustain the process of implantation and even through the pregnancy. Now, if the corpus luteum degenerates, the estrogen and the progesterone would decline. And at that decline rate, we are sending a signal through the negative feedback mechanism to the anterior pituitary that it is time to release more follicle stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormone, and that will begin the cycle. Now let's look at how the luteal phase overlaps with the secretory phase. After the process of ovulation, the Graafian follicle is replaced by the corpus luteum, which we just talked about, and the corpus luteum secretes progesterone, which prepares the endometrium for pregnancy. So you see the endometrium is getting prepared for pregnancy by the secretion of estrogen and progesterone. Now, the progesterone and the estrogen from the corpus luteum suppresses the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Now, this is the case of fertilization. In the case of fertilization, the progesterone and the estrogen from the corpus luteum suppress the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Why are they suppressing it? Because there is a large influx of estrogen and progesterone. Negative feedback system. It is ensuring the hypothalamus that there is no need to produce more follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone because we have a lot of estrogen and progesterone to work with. Now, the hypothalamus will catch that message and cease the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. When the process of stimulating this hormone fails, then we are sure that there is no new follicles stimulating to grow or developing when there is a zygote, which is about to become an embryo and finally a fetus for the remaining process of pregnancy. Now, during fertilization, just like we spoke, the human chorionic gonadotropin steps in. Is stepping in to tell the corpus luteum that, look, I can't watch you degenerate because I still need you. The corpus luteum during the earlier processes of pregnancy, it's what helps in the production of the estrogen and progesterone. The human chorionic gonadotropin is helping to sustain the corpus luteum so that it does not degenerate and become the corpus albicans, so that it can continue to produce the estrogen and progesterone for the growing or the developing embryo before the placenta finally comes in and takes over. Firstly, we said the ovarian phases have three stages: the follicular stage, the ovulation stage, and the luteal stage. And the uterine changes also have three phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. Just like I discussed, I said that the follicular phase works hand in hand with the menstrual and the proliferative phase. The same way, the ovulation happens, and finally, the secretory phase works hand in hand with the luteal phase.